Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Giants in Reproductive Medicine. As always, I'm Pietro Bortoletto, media editor for FNS Reports and interactive associate-in-chief for fertility and sterility. I'm joined by my co-host, Steve Lindheim. Steve, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for doing this again.
It's good to see you and good to hear you. We are really lucky today. We have a very special guest, Dr. Eli Adashi, joining us today on the podcast. Dr. Adashi has a CV that I could spend the next 45 minutes listing accomplishments and past titles, but he told me to just introduce him as Eli, professor of OBGYN at the Warren Alpert School of Medicine at Brown University. Dr. Adashi, it is a pleasure to have you on with us. Welcome.
My distinct pleasure.
We have had the benefit of interviewing some really wonderful guests over the last several weeks, and we've always started the conversation with them at the beginning, telling us about your upbringing. And we always ask, where is home and what were your parents like? Do you mind starting?
No, not at all. So I was born in the city of Haifa in what was then British Palestine, destined to become Israel 3 years later. I was born in 1945. My mother was a kindergarten teacher who ran the shop at home. She was quite good and very well known for her craft. Many children I knew and many who grew up with me were all byproducts of her education. My father was an engineer who worked in a cement factory not too far from where we lived. I was an only child, and so it was really just the three of us. And I spent the first 18 years, more or less, in Haifa growing up. And the rest we can get into as the story unfolds. But fundamentally, sort of conventional upbringing in a relatively small family, although my father had a very large family with which I was heavily engaged. And my mother had also a reasonably sized family. So there were lots of relatives, but no brothers and sisters.
How did the move from Israel to the United States happen? What was the impetus for coming west?
Well, that we have to skip a few things here. I mean, first there's military service, which is obligatory. Then there was medical school. And that did not end until 1972. And then, if you may or may not recall, in 1973, a war broke out, and I ended up being redrafted and spent the next 6 months, initially during the active hostilities and later on in reserve. I was finally released in April 74. Now, by that time, I've made up my mind to do an OBGYN residency. And the reputation of the Israeli
I'd like to interrupt because we all have sentinel events that guide us in that direction. And I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon, but somebody had such a huge impact on me. What happened? What was it with you that made you go into OBGYN?
I would say, in all frankness, it was more an exclusionary decision. I can't say I really had very clear-cut vision at the time of the discipline. I wish I could say otherwise, but I'm being completely open. It struck me as something I would enjoy, and many of the other specialties were clearly out. So to some degree, I would say it was an exclusionary decision. The decision to go into REI was reached in the middle of the night at one point during residency, doing a delivery, realizing that that's not something I'd like to do. And since I wasn't destined to become an oncologist, that left REI as the only option. So I would say through a series of exclusionary decisions, I ended up where I am today. And I suppose many of us end up where we are, not necessarily by dint of some deeply thought reasoning.
So after that 1 a.m. peri-delivery decision to become a reproductive endocrinologist, how did you get a foot in the door, or who opened the door for you to welcome and make sure that you had a path in reproductive medicine.
I think we were discussing the transition to the United States first, and I just want to say that residencies in Israel at the time had the reputation of being exploitative, long, and of a lesser reputation of value than their American counterparts. And so many of my classmates relocated to the States. I don't know exactly how many, but a good percentage. And I ended up securing a contract, so to speak, at Tufts University in Boston. The chair of the department at the time was a certain George Mitchell, remarkable individual in his own right and a contemporary of Ken Ryan, who you may have heard of in your training, whom I knew personally. And if we had more time, I would have liked actually to say much more about. I joined the program in July of 74 and did the required 3 years. It was fortuitous that George Mitchell was a Hopkins product of the Telind vintage. And of course, he grew up with Dr. Howard Jones and Dr. Georgiana Jones. He was from Baltimore. He went with them through the residency program. And so it was a simple matter of picking up the phone for him and recommending me, which is how I think I was enormously lucky and fortunate to have been able to join the Joneses. It was a short stint because they ended up retiring a year later and moving to moving to Norfolk. But it was still a remarkable experience. And yes, I spent that year with Zev Rosenwax and John Rock, both of whom, of course, became known in their own right. And with both of whom I stayed closely connected. But because the Joneses were leaving in 1978, I had to find another locale to finish my fellowship. So it was at that point that I reached out to Sam Yen at UCSD, who accepted me the year before, but whom I turned down. And I had the fear that he will not be willing to entertain my application at that point. But to my fortune, I went actually to the SGI meeting or SRI meeting, which was in Atlanta that year. And I met with him. And he was generous enough to accept me on a resident salary of $14,000 a year. And so I picked up my wife and my son, and we relocated to San Diego. And I ended up spending somewhere between 3 and 4 years, mostly in the lab with Dr. Aaron Shui, who was a very important influence in my formative years, but also being exposed to Sam Yen in the process, meeting with his fellows every week in what was known as a sweat session, in that Dr. Yen was hardly a pussycat, for those of you who have heard about his reputation. And we all sat there sweating, wondering when is he going to turn his attention to us and what question might he be asking, which mostly had to do with productivity. What did you accomplish last week would be the typical question. And so one was under permanent pressure to produce and perform. Despite all these relative shortcomings, once you get away from those hardships, it was a remarkably stimulating environment, replete with excellent fellows like Bob Casper, Bob Reed, and others, and great faculty such as Bob Rebar and Jim Schreiber and others. So those 3-4 years were central to really establishing my career because they provided me with a body of work that I could present during my interviews. And it allowed me to pretty much pick and choose where I can go next, which was in my case, the University of Maryland, which I never regretted, where I spent 15 years as division director and developed my lab career. And it was at that point, 1996, that I moved to Salt Lake City to take the leadership of that department. Jim Scott was retiring after 30 years. And I spent a decade there before Brown recruited me to lead their division of biology and medicine, meaning the medical school and the basic sciences.
Dr. Adashi, as I'm reflecting, and as you're going through all of these things, the impact of the people who are listening, and for those that are listening to this, is just absolutely astronomical. One of the images that you sent that unfortunately today we have not been able to post up here is one of you and Dr. Rock and Dr. Rosenwach. And when I think of my fellowship, I work with Dr. Legro, and it's pretty remarkable. And I was fortunate enough that when I worked with Rick, it was just so collegial and stimulating working with someone like him. Can you tell the audience what was it like to work with such brilliant minds? And then where there was all the stimulation, where did you find your niche? Where did you get that? And I would like you to tell us. I mean, this picture is just astronomical with these 5 home run hitters, and you are a very dapper looking man with the beard here.
Well, I was a first-year fellow, I should say, and Zev and John were second-year fellows. So they managed to actually finish the fellowship at Hopkins. We had weekly lecture series, which were the lot of the first-year fellow. So I would work long and hard to prepare presentations on a list of subjects that were pre-provided. And those two and the Joneses would sit through those quote unquote lectures I would provide. It was in the office of Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones. And so I suppose part of my contribution is that I brought a lot of academic background to those meetings. And I think if I can speak for them, they tended to enjoy the summaries and the information, and occasionally, of course, add to it. John was more surgically inclined. I was never too interested in that part, and so he was tightly affiliated with Dr. Howard Jones and would scrub with him pretty much all the time. Zev was, at the time, more of a medical reproductive endocrinologist. This is pre-IVF. And so he and I had much in common. He eventually, as you know, became a division director of a conventional division in Stony Brook. And there was pre-IVF. And so we were living similar life in different circles, although we stayed in close touch. And then he went to Norfolk to learn the art, and from there to Cornell to apply it. And the rest is history. But we were very simpatico and compatible, and so far removed from the Joneses in terms of age and reputation that there was a lot that bound us. And, you know, we were just aspiring to be anything like the Joneses one fine day. So I hope that gives you some flavor of that year, but which was very amicable and very instructive. And I also learned a great deal from Zev and John. They both were smart, already somewhat partially trained. So there was also Joop Schumacher from Holland who was there a year prior to that. I still managed to overlap a little bit with him. Ann Wentz was still there for a while before she left for Nashville. And not to mention pediatric endocrinology with Claude Mijon and also Georgiana's daughter, who became a pediatric endocrinologist and with whom I'm still in close touch. And their son, Howard Jones, who occasionally would come and scrub with us. Sadly, he passed away about a year ago now, unexpectedly. And the relationship with the Joneses persisted to the very end. I would speak with Howard Jones every 2 weeks on the phone. I would visit with him in Norfolk intermittently. And he lived to be 105, as you know. He was a central influence on my career and my life. And I have much more to say, of course, if we had more time.
If there was one instrumental or one monumental event that took you in the direction, who was the mentor and what was the specific research interest that took you down the path? And as you're embarking in that, what would you encourage the listeners to think about as they, I look at Pietro. Pietro is a rock star. And he's accomplished an enormous amount in such a short period of time. What would you tell people like Pietro and other budding superstars in our field that they should think about and consider as they are looking to do a thing, the right thing, and avoiding mistakes? That's a loaded question.
Right. I would say in the most general of terms that it is hard to plan. I would say it happens rather than it is planned. And by that I mean, even when I left Hopkins, even though my future as a clinical reproductive endocrinologist was assured, I don't think I really found my niche until I met Dr. Aaron Shui, who at the time worked very closely with Dr. Gregory Erickson. And those two really developed new technologies of culture, studied the role of GnRH in the ovary, and really introduced me to a world I knew very little about. And it is that 3-year stint during which we worked very hard and wrote a substantial number of papers. But the lion's share of my investment was really in the lab in those 3-4 years. And that's what allowed me to start a lab on my own when I came to the University of Maryland, develop a research theme of my own, which was the IGFs and the insulin and insulin-mediated hyperandrogenism, and we could go from there. But it really was that investment that created my identity as a physician scientist, as one that had at least a general direction of science. And in those days, you have to realize IGFs were a very nascent concept, and the role of intra-ovarian factor was just evolving. The notion of insulin as a regulator of ovarian function was unheard of. So luckily, and it happened, as I said, rather than it was planned, I stumbled onto Dr. Shui and Dr. Erickson. And it's those 3 years, I think, that ultimately marked my career for the rest of the time, even though once I moved to Brown, I closed the lab and I no longer applied for NIH grants, and I changed my direction. It was no longer feasible simply in the face of the administrative requirements. I'm not saying it's not infeasible. Some people are able to pull it off. I found it to be somewhat incongruent. And maybe it was time for me to do other things and move on. So I did just that. So
you may be pleased to hear that I spent all of yesterday reading about IGF signaling and the insulin receptor because I'm studying for my REI written boards. So much of your work, I think, is still very, very pertinent to people like me who are going back and reading some of the primary literature and the texts and are still facile with the topics.